We are in court here because the government of Alberta wants to hold 3 men accountable. Where's the accountability for government for the 2+3, now almost 4 years of COVID tyranny?
Right.
And that's a question that I will continue to ask. But let's talk about a government who swore an oath to protect its citizens, and they failed. And that has not been addressed. And there can be society cannot move on. There can be no healing if that accountability does not get integrated back into society.
Tuesday's proceedings were primarily consumed with ongoing testimony, cross-examination, and questioning of RCMP officer Mark Wilgosch. He also completed his testimony, and his counterpart, another RCMP officer by the name of Greg Tulloch, continued till the end of the day in the trial of the Coutts Three. This is Robert Kraychik here in Lethbridge, Alberta, reporting for Rebel News. The 3 defendants, Marco Van Hugenbos, Alex Van Herk, and George Jansen, the Coutts Three, are being charged with mischief over $5,000 for their participation, their roles in the 2022 Coutts blockade and protest, which ran alongside the Freedom Convoy demonstration in Ottawa, Ontario. Both were broadly opposed to all of these orders and edicts and mandates, ostensibly serving the interests of public health in response to COVID-19. Today's proceedings saw testimony from 2 Crown witnesses, both of them RCMP officers who operated as liaisons between the federal law enforcement agency and the protesters in the context of the 2022 Coutts blockade. The first witness, he's been testifying already for several days. His name is Mark Wilgosch, an RCMP officer with over 20 years of experience, and he continued making statements along the theme of a decentralized protest. He accepted certain premises presented to him by defense counsels that several factions composed the protest, meaning that there was division within that protest, and also significant disagreement between factions and between protesters over how to proceed, how to conduct themselves, how to deal with the RCMP. So Mark Wilgosch's testimony ended today, and his counterpart, Greg Tulloch, took over. Greg Tulloch also operated in the same capacity as a liaison between the RCMP and the protesters. So Tulloch worked on the days that Wilgosch didn't. They each operated on 4 or 5 day shifts and relieving one another when the other would take off for that period of time. Tulloch also testified about the degree of leadership or lack thereof when questioned in this part by the Crown. A contrast that I noticed, that I observed between the 2 RCMP officers that testified today, Mark Wilgosch and Greg Tulloch, is that the former was much more nuanced and caveated. He hedged much more in his testimony when asked to speculate as to different persons' roles and motivations. Tulloch, on the other hand, was much more confident and direct and assertive when invited to offer his speculation as to what different persons' roles were, in this case, the defendants, in the context of the 2022 Coutts blockade and protest. During one of the breaks, I spoke with George Jansen, one of the defendants, and I asked him if there was any noticeable difference in the demeanors of these 2 officers when he dealt with them in the context of the Coutts protest. And he said to me that the difference between Wilgosch and Tulloch was as if it was the difference between night and day. That's a direct quote. I asked George to elaborate on that difference, and he said that Wilgosch was much softer, much more open-minded, much more congenial in his dealings with Jansen and the protesters in general. And conversely, Tulloch was much more direct and aggressive, much more hard-headed in his dealings with Jansen and the protesters. There was also a difference in the way they dressed themselves. Wilgosch was always in plainclothes, whereas Tulloch was always in full RCMP uniform, complete with body armor. We saw questions about whether or not you folks, you defendants, believed in the legality, the lawfulness of your demonstration. Is that something you want to remark on?
Yeah, I'll remark on that. The jury, there was a mid-trial instruction where the jury was instructed to ignore that because that part of it, it was in relation to it was essentially a legal opinion that hadn't been brought to the court in relation to an individual who hadn't testified. So a mid-trial instruction by Justice Yamanchi instructed the jurors to, in layman's terms, ignore that or strike that off the record to some degree. I'm going to be very clear, and a lot of people have different opinions, and you know, I may be anti-authoritarian to some degree, but I believe in the rule of law. And blocking a highway is unlawful. But we got to remember why we were there and why we were driven to such extremes. What government was doing was unlawful. We now know through the Ingram decision, we now know through the Justice Mosley that the invocation of the act was illegal. We are in court here because the government of Alberta wants to hold 3 men accountable. Where's the accountability for government for the 2 plus 3, now almost 4 years of COVID tyranny?
Right.
And that's a question that I will continue to ask. But let's talk about a government who swore an oath to protect its citizens, and they failed. And that has not been addressed. And there can be society cannot move on. There can be no healing if that accountability does not get integrated back into society.
Okay, so I'm here with Marco Van Hugenbos ahead of the day's proceedings on Wednesday. And Marco, what do you expect to see, or what do you think is important to relay to the audience about what's going on thus far?
Well, today is going to be a big day for me, among others. People are going to hear a lot of things for the first time. I mean, people that were close to me, people that were there from the beginning through the course of the protest. We're going to see evidence come to light, testimony be put to the court about on things that I did, things that I ended up working with the RCMP on to ensure that this was a peaceful protest. And I really want to reiterate that point. There may even be a video that comes up today, how my focus, a big part of my focus was keeping the protest peaceful, no violence, and how safety for protesters, safety for attendees, safety for the RCMP was paramount. That is something that the RCMP has spoken to and will continue to acknowledge, is that there was no violence during those 18 days, and that my involvement, my role in this protest was a key critical piece to ensure that even though the RCMP and the protesters had different objectives and we didn't agree on the main element of the protests and lanes open and lanes blocked, things like that, the focus was always on peaceful protest, and that violence remained outside of the boundaries of the event, and that public safety was paramount.
Just to give one bit of context to the audience, just specifically, RCMP Officer Mark Wilgosh testified to exactly what Marco is referring to. He emphasized that peaceful assembly was the nature of the game, was the atmosphere. He also testified in agreement with the premise put to him that Marco actually was a useful figure towards pursuing that end when asked to do so by one of the defense counsels. The importance of testimony regarding the decentralization of the protest is that it relates to a central claim from the prosecution, which is that the 3 defendants, the Coutts Three, amounted to a leadership of the protest with a degree of direction and control and influence over the protesters. The Coutts Three trial currently has dates scheduled until April 19th. It may conclude sooner, it may go longer, but that's where we're at right now. Dear Rebel News audience, please help us raise some funds to offset the costs for the legal defense of the 3 defendants. You can do so by visiting Coutts3.com and make a donation. And if you do, you'll be issued a charitable receipt, because this fundraiser is being administered by the Democracy Fund, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting constitutional rights and freedoms that we work with at Rebel News. Secondarily, please help fund our operational costs at Rebel News to produce this in the field original journalism. Specifically, that relates to me and me coming out here from Ottawa and paying for airfare, rental car, Airbnb, other costs and supplies. You can do so if you value what we're doing by visiting truckertrials.com, and also stay up to date with our ongoing coverage of this trial and that with Chris Carbert, and Anthony Olenek.